Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Federation Hall. And if you're joining us from Zoom land, also welcome to Federation Hall. My name's David Sequeira, and I'm the director of the Fiona and Sydney Meyer Gallery, and also the person who gets to program the Art Forum lecture series here at the VCA. And before I introduce our guest speaker, David Thomas, I invite you all to join me in grounding yourself in the deep knowledge that long before the VCA was thought of, or the University of Melbourne, that the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation practiced painting and sculpture on this land. They shared stories, they practiced healing, they made dances here, and we don't take it lightly that we get to do what we do on this unceded land, and it really is with great honour that I acknowledge traditional custodians and elders past, present and emerging. So our guest speaker today, David Thomas. His work explores the contemplative function of painting as a contemporary practice. Of particular interest to David are the ways in which new iterations of the monochrome tradition can explore the perception of time and space, complexity, impermanence, knowing and feeling. David was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He was educated in Australia, studying at the University of Melbourne, Monash University and RMIT University, where he's an Emeritus Professor in the School of Art. His work is held in numerous national and international private and public collections. His exhibition, Love Poem to Life, currently on show at Heide Museum of Modern Art, is a site-specific exhibition that responds to the history, architecture and atmosphere of Heide Modern. Wherever you are, Zoomland or Federation Hall, please make David very, very welcome.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Hope it's a pleasure for you. We'll see. It's strange that the moments in life when things coincide and you have to have these moments of recognition when a whole lot of ideas, a whole lot of people, a whole lot of things come together. And for the people in the room, I think it's really weird when I think of the universe, and this is your destiny to be here today. Isn't it? What a weird thing. It becomes so bizarre when you think of what life does and where it takes you. And for all of us to be together in this room is quite a miracle, really, when you think of why. So hopefully today, when I talk about this project, it may be of some use to you. Not just a normal lecture, but you think that at this time in your life, you can either waste this moment or you can use it. I'd go for the latter. Try and use it, either disagree with it or agree with it. But you're not going to get this moment again. So suffer through it with great joy. There's a YouTube lecture by a Dutch architect and theorist and academic, Lars Spijbroek, and it's based on his amazing book, The Sympathy of Things. Its subtitle is Ruskin and the Ecology of Design. And if you have a look at his YouTube lectures, what is great about them is that they're so full of information that he always runs out of time and never finishes a lecture. And I base my whole principle and strategy of lectures on that idea, that I'm going to run out of time. But rather than being a problem, what was interesting about his lectures running out of time was it made it interesting for me because I wanted to find out more about what he was on about. So one of the things about a lecture is it's a two-part connection between you and me and the ideas. So forgive me if we run out of time, for that is the nature of things. In fact, in life, we are never finished until we run out of time. This project was called Love Poem to Life, and it started probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, when Heide invited me to participate in an exhibition. And if you like, if we break that title up, Love, it deals with an idea of sensation, both intellectual, emotional, intuitive. It deals, in a sense, when we think about sensation, about perception. When you think of poem, you think of the form or the language that's being used. And when you think of life, you think of time, duration, and energy. And I guess they're the things that in my whole practice I've been trying to explore. And in this project, I've tried to give you the idea of what I value and why I make art. And your job today, I hope, is to think about what you value and why you make art. We have external lives. And we have internal lives. On the left, you can see a type of external life, which is my bio, my professional and my public sort of persona. But it doesn't really give you any idea of what my internal life is like. It doesn't give you an idea of why I make the work I make, about what we feel, what we know, what we fear, what we celebrate, and what makes us who we are. But for me, art brings those things together. The external and the internal. And art helps us to consider that and the way we make sense of that. I like to think of what art is necessary for us to make today. This is a question I've asked students for years and asked them to find out what art is necessary for them to make. It's not what I think, it's what they think or what you think. And that is part of your journey and what you should be curious about. What informs those decisions and those experiences. So what follows is part of my journey. There are two aspects of this talk. One is about my work and the project, and the other is really the role of a book or writing for an artist like me. And often I'm going to try and make this useful for you, because in a university art school, we often have to bang on about writing and theory and history and stuff in a way that sometimes is irrelevant to the way that we feel and think and make art. So hopefully the complexity of what I'm going to show you in terms of a book gives you an idea that there are different forms of writing about art that you can use, whether you're doing a PhD or whether you're writing in your journal or in your sketchbook. And this book that we'll show and go through at the moment is the catalogue for the exhibition at Heide. So it's nice and thick, and it's structured in such a way that it is non-hierarchical. The centre of the book contains the project at Heide and some writings by better writers than me, people like David Cross, professor and artist, who's done a wonderful essay about the practice and the exhibition. There are fragments of other people's writings, from German philosophers to academic friends and artist friends. And throughout the book, there are fragments of my writings and fragments of lectures that I've given over the years. And the book, I guess, takes the form of, oops, daisy. It takes the form of a composite, and I'll talk about what I mean by a composite in a minute. But first of all, I'd like to start the book with this idea of the love poem to life. Are my best days behind me, or will tomorrow offer me a wondrous surprise? One of the things that I think is interesting is that when you get to my age, you're starting to go on a particular course towards the horizon, if you like, to put it politely. I'm going to drop off the perch soon, in other words. And that's a really interesting thing to consider, because we're all in that journey of how we deal with the important things in life and what becomes important to us. So I'll just read through certain fragments. I know you can read it. And one of the things I hate is people reading words that are already on the screen. But this will be little fragments. A very short description. The project Love Poem to Life offers opportunities to engage in reflective experiences of the spatial and the temporal, of the known, imagined, remembered, and felt within the site of Heide Modern. It pictorializes space and time, and is informed by an extended practice of painting. It interrogates colour, space, and time through monochrome and non-objective painting, composite photo paintings, and installation. Love Poem to Life addresses, to use an old title, what matter does, what matter doesn't, what does matter, and what doesn't matter. The book's structure, as I've said, is non-chronological and non-hierarchical. It may be described as a composite structure. The French philosopher Henri Bergson employed the term composite in his writings on duration, time, and perception. And he defines the composite as a situation or structure where things different in kind are reconciled but not unified. And not unified over the time of our experiencing. In other words, it's a complexity. And for me, the use of the composite, both in my practice and in the way that I construct these books and things like that, because it reflects life. Life is a composite. Things are not unified. It's a whole range of diverse things that are different in kind, and they are reconciled over our time of experiencing them. We don't have to unify them into a puree. It can be like a salad where things are different and they sit together in a particular relationship. But one of the things that I find really interesting about giving lectures is that you know when people are bored. And when you have books, you know when people are bored. So this book's got two functions. As well as being about my work, it's a good bedtime read because it will send you off to sleep really quickly. The next part of the book that's quite useful is called the Great One-Liners. And this section will save you time if you don't want to read the longer parts. One of the things about using quotes and using other people's writings is that it's often a shorthand way of setting up particular complexities of ideas. So if you ever do get this book, you'll realize that by reading through some of these quotes, that you will find it unpacks the complexity of aspects of my work. So one of the interesting elements is when you think of this in relationship to contemporary painting practice, is that it offers certain ideas. One of my favorite philosophers is a Frenchman called Michel de Montaigne, who lived in the 17th century. And he was quite tolerant for a Frenchman in the 17th century. He wrote, after he resigned his position as the mayor of Bordeaux, he retired to his manoir and set up a reading room and a writing room where he wrote his essays. And he quoted a lot from the Stoic philosophers of Rome and Greece. And he wrote these things, like he wrote on originality. I quote from others in order to better express myself. On fear, there were many terrible things in my life, and most of them never happened. He wrote on copying accepted tropes. Spewing up food exactly as you have swallowed it is evidence of a failure to digest and assimilate. The stomach has not done its job during concoction. It fails to change the form of what it has been given. In some ways, that's what we all do. We all bring our past, our cultural past that we perhaps know about, the contradictions of all of those things together to make life and to make the situation to make new art. And so this complexity is something that you'll find both in the book and hopefully in the exhibition if you go to see it. The other person that I will quote occasionally from in this is an artist like Pierre Bonnard, who says the most beautiful things in museums are the windows. Now that, as a one-liner, when you unpack it, is a really interesting conceptual idea. And the role of art in relationship to the role of reality is a very important thing for us to consider. So I won't go continually reading through this, but you'll see that by reading widely in life, it gives you great opportunities to understand where you're situated and what your role is in extending and interrogating knowledge. So art is personal as well as cultural. It's a complexity. So there are parts of this book that are quite raw in a sense. They're slightly uncomfortable, but I think necessary to reveal as an artist. This section just deals briefly with my history of Heide, where I first showed in 1981, and also with the fact that my dealer, Georges Mora, acquired the first work for a public collection at Heide, and that I've worked there in the past. On the other pages, on your left-hand side, or right-hand side, is the work that they've acquired, the first work in a public exhibition, which was a figurative 3/4 life-size drawing. The fact that I used to go and have picnics with my family at Heide, and I did a site-specific installation with Christoph Dahlhausen, the German colleague. But we get to the really crux of the matter. The difference in some ways between what we mean by a site-responsive and site-specific thing. I'm not really interested in the history of Heide per se in the way that an art historian might be. I'm interested in the mood that it generates and the associations, the imaginative responses that I might have to a place like Heide. I'll just read this part. These have been dealt with by historians. However, upon reflecting on them as I have, they do generate imaginative responses to what it means to be human, to have relationships, to live in a particular place, and to pass through life. We all have to negotiate our life's journey with its politics, its poetry, its order, its chaos, and its humour. We all will celebrate and question our loves and losses, our pains, joys, ambitions, and successes, and failures, and hopefully find a balance and wonder at its fragile transience, even with our deeply felt imperfect understandings. In some ways, that's what I feel my work is like. It is deeply imperfect, but it's got this fragile, transient quality that you can't get by being a perfect idealist artist. This book's full of little quotes from lectures that I've given, and this one was called Up a Ladder in an Ivory Tower. Let's think about values for a moment. In the year 2001, I was up a ladder in an ivory tower doing a wall painting for an exhibition entitled Painted Spaces. It had toured to Accra, the Auckland Art Gallery, and was travelling to Scotland to the Talbot Rice Gallery at the University of Edinburgh. From my higher than normal vantage point, I noticed that below me passed a bald-headed man dressed in tweed, surrounded by an entourage of curators and academics dressed in black. He was on his way to give a speech. I didn't hear it, I painted. I sensed he was important. In fact, I was to learn later that he was a Nobel laureate for literature. He was the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. And it was the closest I've ever been to a Nobel laureate for literature. I guess you could say I have a unique perspective on him from our one-sided encounter. In his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize for Literature was actually entitled Crediting Poetry. He said, "Poetry is the power to persuade that vulnerable part of our consciousness of its rightness in spite of the evidence of wrongness all around it. The power to remind us that we are hunters and gatherers of values, that our very solitudes and distresses are creditable insofar as they too are an earnest for our veritable human being." And I claim the same space for visual art. These were handouts that I'd often give to master students, and we would spend a long time unpacking what those things meant to each of us. And I'll just go through the structure of the book and the way that it's layered. This section, which is Context and Values 2. So why do I make art or try? For two reasons. One, I use it as a means to feel alive in the world. Professor Shelley Sachs, an artist and academic from Oxford Brookes University, in her introduction to the book, What is Art? Conversations with Joseph Beuys, defines the aesthetic as the opposite of anesthetic. That is, it's the opposite of the act of dulling feeling. The aesthetic, in this sense, means enlivening, heightening our experience of living. It is not about a sense of style or taste. Art enables me to be curious and to understand and to learn and to reflect on being. This includes being attentive to my processes of perception and how I construct meaning. It enables me to try many things. For art enables us to engage with the material, the conceptual, the known, the imagined, and the felt. My work reflects an exploration of colour in the world of light, time, materials, art, relationships, feelings of thinking about the random, the composed, and transients. And in my case, I'm arguing for a slow art. And so one of the things in making a book that's got these layers, which also includes this quote from Thomas McEverley, which was another handout we'd give to candidates, students, undergraduate and postgraduate, to unpack what content is. I decided I needed to make the book personal as well as sort of half academic. And you'll notice in the language that I'm using, it's trying to be a direct language, not trying to use the appropriate theoretical terms that an art historian or theorist might use. It's still trying to get content across to you, but it's trying to get the content in a readable, simple way. And my experience, especially supervising PhD students, is that they've got a false idea of what a PhD is. They think about the style of what an imagined PhD could be, and they feel they have to write in that academic style. A PhD can contain whole ranges of different forms of writing. And as an artist, you can write intellectually, you can write theoretically, or you can write in a personalized way. You can write in a form that is of a PhD, or you can write in a journalese form. And by I had a discussion with the editors and with the curator, Leslie Harding, about whether I'd put a page like this in. And I realized one of the things I like doing when I look at an art book, or any book really, is to look at how people live and what they've done. And the purpose of this is not just to talk about my biographical life, but to try and emphasize for each of us that our lives are important enough to pay attention to. That we don't have to be, we can ground our art and ground our beliefs in who we are. So these are often images from the 70s with my wife and family, and unfortunately some photographs of me from student identity cards and things like so. So the book goes through talking about painting and what I regard painting's role and its function in the contemporary world. Pierre Bonnard wrote, "It's not a matter of painting life, but of giving life to painting." And then I bang on about being a young art student in the 70s and start to talk about looking at some earlier work, this one from 1999 to 2000, which was called Three Spaces and Times in Paris. And it's a figurative painting of a street in Bagnolet in Paris where I was living, a monochrome and a reflection zone. And in some ways, it sums up the complexity of the issues I'm still exploring. When you think of a figurative painting, you're thinking about illusion, but you're also thinking about the time of making. And you're thinking of what happens behind the picture plane as well as its facture on the surface. When you think of a monochrome, you're thinking of a direct sensation of colour. And again, a different duration of time in terms of both the way it's made, but also the associations, whether it's the actuality of something like the material reality of a surface, or whether it's the metaphysical allusion to an endless atmosphere. And then with the reflection section, it reflects the viewers in front of the picture plane. So the viewer space and the reality in which the viewer exists. And for me, that relationship is important, and you'll see that in the Heide exhibition. Those elements where the viewer is important because the viewer completes the work in a particular way. This page talks about the role of painting as a still thing that shows us that we are moving, and talks briefly about it in relationship to the cinematic use of video, that with the painting, the viewer moves. With the video, the images move, but the viewer is static. It's almost like you're being in the perfect viewing spot of a Renaissance painting when you're looking at a video. Video installation blurs that, but if you're looking at a screen-based thing, you're static. When you notice the way people look at paintings, they move. And so therefore there's a bodily engagement with the near and far, the oblique with the frontal. So a painting like this, which generates that idea, is essentially a large-scale yellow monochrome. It's 244 by 183 centimetres. So you imagine you in front of it and how it fills your field of vision. You'll notice there are white sections in it that create a type of rotation. And you'll notice also that there's a vague sense of the way it's made. It's not a perfectly flat thing. There's a sense of the brush mark, the duration of making. So the function of these sorts of paintings is multiple in that way, that it has the role of asking the viewer to engage in becoming aware of their own perceiving. So I'm just going through some of these things quickly, and you'll get an idea of some of the context for the actual exhibition that we'll get to in a minute. You'll also notice the function of titles in my work. In the 80s and 90s, most of my work were untitled. And then I went to Paris and started to make a book of titles that I'll show you in a minute. These works are part of a series called the Impermanences that includes images of single works, both here in Australia and in New York, where my work's represented by a particular gallery, minus space. And it hovers on the edge of non-objective work because it brings the photographic into it. And these are photographs printed on copy paper, so they're not permanent, they're not archival. They'll last long enough. They don't need to last forever because nothing does. So these give you an idea of some of the particular qualities that you can only get through working with particular materials, such as the copy paper. So you get this fragile quality of buckling. The work on your right is called Finding Perspective London. And these are large-scale works as well. And then we get on to this idea of the importance of colour in my work and the role of colour and the difference between colour theory and practice. When you actually paint and you mix colour, it's very different to looking at a colour wheel. pigments have got their own properties. It's really different to working from light and pigment. And there's a whole range of things that we can discuss about those elements. Some of these works use direct monochromes on windows. So there's an inside-outside component. There's a series called When Two Directions on the grey work on the bottom, when two directions become all directions, which deals both with the illusionary space of an atmosphere behind the picture plane, as well as the surface, and as well as the left-right counterpoint movements. These are a series of works from the 90s at Tolano and in Paris. I guess I've spoken about Bergson very briefly. What was interesting for me about Bergson was not just what he had to say, but he gave me a language to think about. And there were certain words like the composite and like duration, but also his writings. I think I'll just read you 4 quotes because I think they help understand, or me understand, certain components. When sitting on the bank of a river, the flowing of the water or the gliding of a bird, the uninterrupted murmur of deep life are for us 3 different things, or a single one at will. So he talks about the relationship between intention and perception. There do not exist things made, but only things in the making, not states that remain fixed, but only states in the process of change. And perception is the object of perception minus everything that does not interest us. And memories exist only when they are recoverable in the present. So I'm going to go a bit quicker and we'll just get to the exhibition. But I will talk about humour first. And that's a very difficult thing to talk about because it's as boring as anything talking about humour. One of Bergson's books is on laughter. And it's one of the most boring books you'll ever read. And probably when I'm talking about humour, it is not quite the same as laughing or being humorous. But I want to talk about this work, which is part of a series called Simple Complexities. And it's just called Couple with a Blowfly. And after that, we'll get on to the briefly through the exhibition. How are we going for time, David? Cool. The series and the work reflects my interest in moments where, via the framing of the camera, intention gets mediated by accident, or content gets altered through the use of a title, and as a result, where the originally might be considered a failure, in this case, a portrait photograph, offers a new content to be revealed over the time of looking. In this photo, a blowfly photobombs the picture, right in the middle of the selfie. One sees numerous such images on Instagram and the like. I love the simple ordinariness in this photograph, the unintentional dumbness of this incident. It talks to me of the macro-micro relations and of being situated in the middle of it all, of the intended being placed in relationship to the random. It is part of the series of similar subjects from my archive of small 4 by 6 centimetre prints. I choose this size because it is harder to see detail, not easier. I want the viewer, if they're going to look, to have to work a little, and in doing so be rewarded with a discovery. Its physicality makes the experience of looking quite different from the ambiguous scale of computer or iPhone imagery. The small picture has another effect and affect. It demonstrates a situation where ego is deflated, where the anthropocentric understanding and intention of the photographer, me, is destabilized by reality, by the fly. The artwork exists as a relationship of permeable spaces, times and contents. It accommodates and questions fixed subject-object relationships. It amazed me that such an incidental image could address such large questions. It questions and places the ideal in relationship with the actual. The work moves us from the notion of a fixed content or idea or thing to a temporal relationship, to a composite structure. Philosophically, we could consider it as a movement backwards and forwards between ideas of essence, the anticipated ideal of the perfectly envisaged portrait, and becoming, the intervention of the fly as an example of the imperfect dynamism of life. I realized several things from this series: that the human subject is surrounded by a bigger reality, a smaller and bigger nature, one beyond our ego, that the world interferes with my intentions, often in a better way than I could have planned, that long after and long before my presence, nature, infinity exists. This blowfly triggered a moment of recognizing transience in the world, including my own. And if I believe we can come to terms with our own transience, we are more likely to have a balanced and fulfilled life. My appreciation of the value of these small photos, of how they work, developed from my understandings of pictorial composition, derived from the paintings and films of artists like Pierre Bonnard and Jacques Tati. They employed devices of contrast of scale and placement to slow readings of content in the work. In doing so, they not only disrupted expectation, but created humor. Now, there is nothing more humorless than discussing humor, as I've said endlessly, but humor is the result of change, of unexpectedly shifting content in time. To enable this to happen, we have to recognize and deal with the principles pictorial timing, whether on a picture plane of painting or photography, or in the time space of installation or in life. That is, we need to employ the principle of timing, the principle of deferral. In couple with a blowfly, content is deferred through the use of scale and contrast. Our eyes will normally go to the points of greatest contrast first. In this case, the large, dark, light shapes of figures and sky. And this delays the reading of what it is at the center of this photograph, the blowfly. The fly exists here as several things: as a paradox, as a representation of a fly, a moment of movement, an empty shape of photo paper, a buzzing, fuzzing miniature monochrome shape depending on our intention or care in looking. It exists in the middle of a picture made visible by what it is not. As soon as we recognize this form as a blowfly situated in this space, it activates and extends our understanding of the space of the picture. We feel things in front and behind and in between each other. Space becomes dynamic. It is a slippage of readings in this work that gives it its energy, its humor, or to some, its stupidity. We are part of a mysterious changing world. Everything is part of, and this is what all my work explores. All is amid it all, informed by its surrounding contexts. So we'll go quickly to the Heide show. And as we go through this selections from the book of titles, which is another way of talking about content, not in essay form. But when you put all your titles together, they become a giant poem, or they become a treatise on content in your work. So we get to Heide. One of the ways I'll simplify the experience of the exhibition is just by describing how we walk through the space. The first experience that you get when you enter is one of luminosity and colour. These paintings become almost like wall paintings, and they take you through various spaces. You get glimpses of other works as you go through. Each of them, each person's given a room sheet with titles on them. And the titles, again, are the way of perhaps pointing people towards things they may or may not have considered. So a work like this, which fills a room, deals in quite a simple way with ideas that I've explored in the past. And the work is simply called Green Atmosphere, Beyond the Picture Plane, the Garden. And that in some ways falls into a concept of art that is informed by Asian art, by the borrowed landscape that you see in Korean landscape gardens, in Japanese gardens, and to some degree in English country gardens, where rather than dealing with the landscape, it gets framed by what surrounds it or what's in front of it. And so again, this is an attempt to situate and go beyond the obvious context of the architecture of Heide into the gardens of Heide and into the history of those gardens without being explicit, to cultures that existed long before Heide Modern and the Reeds. Other parts will then go into rooms where you get an idea of composite ideas, where those notions of photography, performance, colour sit together in particular ways. Or reflection paintings on mirrors, or rubber ducks in the shower, or on the other right-hand side again, a painting called A Surprise for Malevich. So that the viewer gets reflected in that work as well. And then as you go down through the spaces, there are various experiences. On the large walls, there are often small paintings, and on other works, such as this one called Life Together, there are large paintings where the chromatic structures are made together. There are memory rooms, or there are rooms for contemplation, or rooms for attentive looking. There are works that have got this sense of transience where monochromes are placed on the wheels, and that is a response to the architecture of Heide, where from the balcony you look down upon the work and pictorialize the space in a particular way. There are reflection paintings that work and include dust and light and the moving image of the person perceiving or the person in front of them. There are large impermanent works. And there are these works of the small, simple complexity photographs that are attached to the outside of the building in particular ways. And what you have, again, is the outside and inside in dialogue. So that thin screen of glass is the dividing line between the interior and the exterior. And on the next level is this unfinished timeline painting. And those photographs that you see dance along that horizontal, but also imply the space beyond. And the photograph is a moment in time in relationship to a duration in time. There are small scale paintings that are about transience, the on-off paintings on the right-hand side, and a photo called Making Love in a Cold Climate of a person drawing a heart in the snow in London. And then there are these impermanent sculptures on wheels that occasionally will pop up. So there's about 60 odd works of quite different sorts. There's a little room I call the Room of Compassion, where there's a broken sculpture. There's a number of bad puns, and there's a range of levels of content from the formal to the informal. The rest of the book deals with essays by other people and some early drawings. I put these in because the idea of attentive looking is central, and attentive thinking is central to the project. So these works come out of the 70s and 80s. And might be of interest for some of the students here to think about the painting in the top right, left for you, is a painting called Walkerville. And it deals with an interior, an exterior, a reflection, a figure, a landscape, a still life, geometry, nature, and the blur. It was done last century in 1982. And those things are manifest in the exhibition at Heide in slightly different forms. But paintings like that can become the generative elements for your unknown future. So pay attention to the things that feel a bit awkward in your work so that you can continue on with them. So on that note, I think I shall stop.
Thanks so much, David. I so appreciate your generosity and, taking us through this project so beautifully. We've got a couple of moments for questions if anybody has a question for David.
I've got them.
Right. Well, no, you've got a question. I knew there was a question. Yeah, please.
Hi, Renee. Yeah.
I was thinking about the way that I experienced it. So thinking about how some works, when you come to a gallery, you experience them and actually think to leave in the place. And even though you're dealing with kind of conventions and monochrome, like in the presence of your work, walking through the gallery, I have a bodily sensation, an emotional sensation. I feel it in a very particular way. And I was wondering about that relationship between the attentiveness that we bring, like going back to those early sketches, and that sort of attentive looking and thinking. And I'm wondering, is the experience, do you think the experience I'm having of your work is connected to the attentiveness that you're applying, the way that you're?
Yeah, there's certain forms, like the way something's made, it's really important. And a lot of the titles like this, When Two Directions Become All Directions, the Gently Painted series is the full title. So that's the way something is painted carries reading, the French idea of facture, where meaning, and as human beings, we respond to things in a particular way, that we've all got particular sensations that are biological. So when something's sharp, we know it's sharp. When something's soft, we know it's soft. When something's reflective, we respond to it differently. So you can construct those things, but you can't construct the specifics, or you can't construct the cultural overlays of some of those things. So one of the things I didn't get to was about colour and the way colour works differently in different cultures. We all have an experience of colour that is biological, you know, whether it's bright or energetic or whatever. But when we translate that into meaning, that becomes where culture enters into it, and it becomes a very different thing. So you've heard me bang on before about, you know, kids in Northeast Asia will draw the sun usually red. Western kids will usually draw it yellow. It still means the same thing, but it's got a very different form. But it's also the way that sun will get drawn, whether it's drawn with energy or not. And that will give you, again, a more total reading. So your responses will construct that. There's one more quote that I'll try and find quickly by a Swiss artist, Helmut Ferdelay. He tried to talk to the idea that what the minimalists tried to say, people like Stella, tried to say is what you see is what you see, what you get. And he prefers it that Stella should have said, what you see is who you are. And to me, that's the debate that we all have between the personal and the cultural, between the public and the private. And as artists, we all have to negotiate that. So I think you'll experience my work in particular ways that will be similar to me, but there'll be also the opportunity for you to experience it in your own way.
Anyone else? Yes, please, Luke.
I have yet seen the show, but I'm curious about the works that are now from you.
Yeah.
What is the balance? Information of moving, but do people move amongst them and do they sometimes actually move?
Yeah, if people knock them, they move. They're not skateboards, but yeah. I want people to feel comfortable. If they knock them, it's not the end of the universe. There's two elements to that, and the reason for that. One is the structure of Heide with the balconies, that when you look down on stuff, you can see the floor, and there was a way of pictorializing that space by using, you know, works on the floor. It's also partly to do with the heritage of Heide. You're not allowed to, you know, drill into walls and things like that. So there was a way of animating particular imagery. You know, one's called The Fall of Barcelona, and the other one is called Looking Down Upon the Earth from that vantage point. And it comes, again, out of this idea of how do we represent or manifest the idea of transience. So the wheels have got that implicit idea of mobility. But there's also, I don't know if you remember, I think it was in the 70s, Leo Steinberg wrote a book, Other Criterion, and he had this thing called the flatbed theory. So that when something's horizontal, you tend to see its objectness first. When something's vertical, you see its pictorial or imagery first. And when something's on the angle, you're in between that space. He was one of the first people to write on installation practice. And so there are elements of those things. It's not that you don't see the picture of something's horizontal, but it's the sort of what we experience first and how it then comes back to a pictorial. So there's a deferring element in how you can play with those components. So the play with that space was in order to bring a subtle politic to it in terms of both the content of the Fall of Barcelona, which was imagery that I'd taken in Barcelona of a performance, but also indirectly that history of what the fall might mean. And then looking down upon the earth, which was using the architecture as well in a poetic sense to think about time, space, those things.
We're going to leave it there, but David, on behalf of everybody here and everybody in Zoom land, thank you so much for taking us through the Heide project, which is not just an exhibition, but also a publication. And the book launch was last night, and I haven't finished reading the book, but the book has this experiential quality to it that transcends reading. It's kind of a bit like walking through an exhibition or walking through a career in a multi-layered pictorial journalistic way. I don't really know whether I'm doing it justice, but thank you so much for your generosity, and on a personal note, thank you for your mentorship over many, many years. Please join me in thanking David.
I'll give one plug for the book. There's a launch of it again at Block Projects on Saturday, where there's a show of small paintings that are opening. So if any of you want to come along to Block Projects on Saturday, feel free. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you.